Let's take a look at some of the steps involved to get to here when you're starting from here. About 6 years ago, thinking about another retirement project, I thought I might try to build an instrument and chose a concert ukulele. I really enjoyed the process and the product was good enough that I decided to carry on. Since then, I've completed 3 more concert ukuleles, 1 tenor ukulele, 4 baritone ukuleles, 3 3/4 size guitars, and 3 archtop mandolins. The family have all of them except one of the baritone ukuleles, which I'm hanging on to. I'm no longer building instruments, but I thought it would be interesting and fun to try to document some of the steps I used in the building process. I'm making this video especially for our family, but others might find it interesting too, and it's possible that someone might be inspired to take up this rewarding hobby. The web, of course, has a wealth of information out there, and I benefited immensely from forums, from equipment supplier information, and from many of the step-by-step instructional videos that are out there. So note, this is not a step-by-step instructional video, but a collection of steps and ideas and workarounds that I found helpful and in my instrument building journey and others might find interesting. I'm in the last half of my 8th decade and over the years have been able to accumulate both tools and experience working with wood. I've completed projects as diverse as kitchen and china cabinets, rocking horses and chairs, cedar strip kayaks, freighter canoes, and jewelry boxes. The major items in my workshop are table saw, band saw, router, bench sander, random orbital sander, drill press, flexible shaft tool, and a dust collection system. I have items more specific to instrument making that I made, modified, or acquired that I will mention as we go along. So here we go. Of course, choosing your material is a critical first step, and there are lots of resources out there to help you decide. For most of the soundboards, I've used tight-grained Sitka spruce, but I've also used koa. Sitka is shown here. Ideally, the grain would be more perpendicular to the surface, but this piece worked pretty well. For the backs and sides, I've used walnut, koa, maple, grenadillo, and cherry, and all with success from my point of view. I particularly tried to avoid run-out grain on the pieces I cut for the sides, as run-out could, or probably will, cause a problem when it is time for bending. To cut my lumber into thin slices, I first checked that the blade was perpendicular to the table and set the fence for a cut at least a millimeter thicker than what the plan called for. I was unable to use a blade guard on such a narrow cut, so I made sure I had a good stance, a firm grip on the piece, and stood well clear of the likely path of any kickback. I held the piece tight to the fence with homemade fingerboards clamped firmly to the saw table. The maximum width of the body on the largest instruments I made, the 3/4 size guitars, is about 12.5 inches, so for those I had to be able to cut pieces that were a little more than 6 inches wide. I can expose almost 3 inches of blade on my 10-inch table saw, so 2 passes almost made it clear through. I cut through the small bit that was left with a pull saw. These 2 pieces will be joined to become a guitar back. To thin the pieces down to whatever the plan called for, I used this thickness sander. I made it by repurposing parts from a surface sanding tool that never did work very well. The major component is a 2-inch diameter shaft, approximately 16 inches long, covered with Velcro hook material. The shaft is supported by end bearings and driven by a 2-horse motor. Velcro loop sandpaper is wound around the shaft, anchored at the ends by black tape. Turning the threaded rod raises or lowers the table. Even with coarse 80 grit sandpaper mounted on the shaft, it is a slow process, especially with the wider pieces. The tool could only remove a little material at a time, but by running a piece through several times, I could finish with whatever thickness the plan called for. I used a push stick to to push the piece toward the shaft and pulled it by hand from the opposite side to complete a pass. The bottom of the shaft rotates toward the operator, so I was careful to stand to one side, just in case I lost control of a piece. The easily removed dust collector hood worked very well. Once the backs or soundboard pieces were close to the final thickness, I trued up the edges on adhesive-backed sandpaper glued to a super flat surface, a marble slab. I epoxied them together on a gluing platform with a vertical lip at the back. I usually glued a narrow contrasting strip between the two back pieces. Tapered wedges and quarter-inch dowels are used to clamp the pieces tightly together, and makeshift clamping cauls are used to hold everything tight to the platform. This is a Sitka spruce soundboard being glued up. A serious luthier could buy a go board from Stumac for around $800, but I made this one for next to nothing. A go board uses flexible rods to clamp braces to soundboards and backs when gluing. The running thread rods on the top of the box allowed me to adjust the tension on the flexible rods. I used fiberglass rods from an old tent. I had to split them in two to make them flexible enough and used eye protection, mask, and gloves to do that job, as the fiberglass rods do not split cleanly. I taped them full length, then taped a small piece of rubber around each end so they wouldn't slip. The instrument backs are curved, so I made forms with the reverse curve built in and shaped the Sitka spruce braces to fit. This drill-mounted sander was helpful here for rough shaping. At this point, I was mainly concerned about carefully fitting the outer side of the curved brace to the form and left the final shaping of the inner side till later. Once the back is glued, I used the bandsaw to roughly cut out the shape, staying well outside the final lines. Next, I glued a birch reinforcing strip over the contrasting strip. Now, the go board really comes into play. It takes several flexible rods to hold the braces in place and to make sure the back takes the shape of the mold. Before gluing braces to the soundboard, I needed to route out the channel for the rosette and then the sound hole itself. I had previously made a holder for my flexible shaft tool out of UHMW polyethylene and acrylic so I could mount it in a vise. I added an acrylic adjustable circle cutting jig to the tool holder that could rotate around a quarter-inch dowel. After a few practice cuts, it was ready to go. I drilled a quarter-inch hole in the center of the future sound hole and used a dowel as a pivot point. A scalpel was handy for some trimming. My rosettes got a little fancier over time. For this one, I cut thin slices from a piece glued up from poplar and dark walnut. The slices need to be a bit thicker than the depth of the channel, and the whole thing was sanded down after it was glued in place. The pieces were epoxied around a form fixed to 1/4-inch foam board using pins to hold things tight. I scraped the inner or hidden side of the rosette flat, fit it to the channel, then epoxied it into place and sanded the top smooth. I used a circle jig to cut out the sound hole and epoxied the inner contrasting strip into place. The go board was pretty much essential when it came time to glue the soundboard bracing, the bridge reinforcement, and the rosette reinforcement into place. Time now to shape and sand the braces and clean up the inner surfaces of the soundboard and back. I made forms for the sides out of pieces of 3/4-inch material, stacked a little higher than the widest part of the instrument side. The two halves were kept in position with dowels and were joined together with cleats at each end. The inner surface was sanded smooth. The sides were cut out according to the plan template, and when bending was about to happen, they were soaked in a trough of distilled water for typically 20 to 30 minutes. This trough was made from plastic-lined cardboard. In this image, poplar bindings are soaking at the same time. This is my bending device. I started with a heavy aluminum tube that I cut to length and bent into a slight oval shape. The heating element is a 100-watt incandescent light bulb that I hung onto as we changed to LEDs. It fits nicely in the tube and is screwed into a porcelain lamp holder that is fixed on the other side of the plywood piece. The end of the tube has a centimeter of insulation between two aluminum end plates. When I built it, I didn't know if it would work, but it certainly did. I used it for all my bending. Once the tube was hot enough to steam off a drop of water, it was ready to go. Bending is a slow process, and I needed to wait for the wood to heat up and relax before I could bend it carefully, then move ahead another couple of centimeters. I had a spray bottle handy to keep the wood moist and to deliver more steam. I used the form to frequently check the progress of the bends, and when the full length was softened and bent, I used rubber straps or stretch cords to attach the piece to the form, then set it aside to dry. I cut the side pieces a bit longer than required to make sure I didn't end up short, then trimmed them as required. When the sides were trimmed and fit, the head block and butt block were glued into place. The head block has a mortise routed out to accept the tenon that will be on the neck. It also has holes drilled for the bolts that will hold the neck to the body. This image shows a long stick that fits tightly into the mortise. I used it to ensure that the mortise lined up correctly with the instrument centerline before the glue set. I bent the bindings and strapped them to a form to dry. The kerfed linings are made from basswood. After cutting strips to the profile shown on the plan, I set up a jig to cut the kerfs. I clamped a board to the bandsaw table that had a notch cut to the right depth for the saw blade, and another notch with a piece of hardwood glued into place to set the spacing between the kerfs. The soft basswood had to be bent very carefully, and I learned to live with some cracking. I needed several clamps when it came time to glue the linings in place. This image shows the linings glued in, but it also shows the bolt holes through the head block. The mortise is now hidden under a glued-on cap. The marble slab was very helpful when it was time to flat sand the instrument top, and now it was time to glue the soundboard to the sides. I tried different approaches to decorate the butt, but found I liked a tapered, contrasting piece. I book matched the insert, then clamped it in place and used a scalpel to score the outline. I slowly chiseled out the material down to the butt block itself and fit and glued the piece into place. The taper allowed me to get a tight fit. This shows the neck blank already glued up, but it is made from two pieces, book matched and separated by a contrasting wood. Book matching the pieces ensures that the grain in each piece opposes the other, and in theory this will help keep the neck straight. I'm setting up a taper jig here to make the cut for the headpiece. The next step for the neck was to drill holes for the threaded 1/4-inch inserts that the neck bolts screwed into. These need to be drilled carefully, so I made a vertical jig to mount on the drill press. I used a series of bits to reach the hole diameter I needed. Here, the tenon has been cut, and I'm using a double nutted bolt to drive in the threaded insert. This bolt will eventually hold the tenon on the neck tightly into the mortise in the head block. It gets tightened by an Allen wrench from inside the body of the instrument. I routed a channel along the length of the neck to accept the neck stiffener. The neck gets cut roughly into shape with a bandsaw. For most of the instruments I made, the neck stiffener is made from a laminated piece of oak, wrapped in 2 layers of resin-soaked fiberglass cloth. For the 3 3/4 size guitars, though, I embedded a double-acting truss rod, accessible from inside the body instead of the oak stiffener. These images also show the wings added to the headpiece to accommodate the tuners. I used a pull saw to remove some excess wood on the neck, and used this safety planer from Stumac to produce a parallel surface on the underside of the headpiece. Before working more with the relatively soft Sitka spruce soundboard, I coated it with a layer of epoxy, then scraped it thin with an old ID card. Fitting the neck to the body is an exacting step. The neck needs to match the plane of the soundboard, align with the instrument center line, and fit tight to the body, and the tenon needs to fit snugly in the mortise. This was always a time-consuming job, and the neck was typically mounted and dismounted several times in the process. Now I could seriously start shaping the neck. I used rasps, sanding drums, the random orbital sander, and a sanding block to get it to a shape I was happy with. The micrometer came in handy. I used a thin veneer of book-matched material for the surface of the headpiece, and shaped and fit the mother-of-pearl crescent moons for the headpiece decoration. I cut the mother-of-pearl from abalone shell that had been on my shelf for a long time. I'm led to believe that the reports of the toxicity of the shell dust have often been exaggerated, but I still took the precaution of wearing a mask while cutting the shell and ventilating the area with the dust collector. I used a drill, then a jeweler's saw to rough out the matching shape in the veneer, then gradually filed the veneer and the mother-of-pearl piece to get a tight fit, then epoxied it into place. A Forstner bit is used to rough out the slots for the slotted headpiece after the tuner holes have been drilled. Next step, clean up the slots with rasp and files, then a sanding drum on the flex shaft tool. On to the fretboard. Here it is a little oversized, but it has been taken down to the correct thickness. The fret slots are cut in before the board is tapered, so the frets are perpendicular to the center line. The board is placed in a tight-fitting jig, and the slots are cut with a fret saw. A block clamped across the jig prevents the saw from cutting too deep. With the slots cut, holes are drilled to accommodate the side markers and the fretboard dots. I made the mother-of-pearl dots with tile-cutting diamond bits. I was able to drill them out in a tray of water to eliminate dust. For the side markers, I used plastic rod, available from a hobby store. To prevent the fretboard from sliding around while gluing it in place, I positioned the board with no glue, then drilled tiny holes through the fret slots into the neck. After the glue is applied, the pins ensure that the fretboard doesn't slide around while clamping. This neck is pretty much finished. Once the fretboard was sanded, I applied several coats of True Oil, which is the final fretboard finish. Once it is dried, it gets polished with steel wool. Fret wire looks like this. The tiny teeth on each side of the tang help grip the fret solidly into place in the fret slot. I cut each fret to length, then filed the ends round and polished them with a rubber polishing disc. I cleaned the excess True Oil from the slots with a hook-shaped notch cut into a thin cabinet scraper. I rested the fretboard on my short length of railroad iron and tapped the frets into place with a plastic-tipped hammer. Once I was happy with the way the neck fit, it was time to glue the back in place. The bindings were glued into place in a channel that was routed out with the flex shaft tool. To do this, I screwed a UHMW jig to the tool holder, shaped to allow just the right amount of router blade to be exposed, and curved to accommodate the inside curve at the waist. It typically took a few passes to get a uniform channel. The green tape is actually binding tape, a bit stretchy and stronger than normal masking tape. Great stuff, and I used a lot of it. The final fixing of the neck to the body requires some care. The straight edge helps check that the neck is in line with the instrument center line and that its surface stays parallel to the soundboard as the bolts inside are tightened. Now on to finishing. No photos here of the process, but I sanded the instrument up to 320 grit, then applied this General Finishes water-based finish. I used a foam brush to apply 6 thin coats on the soundboard and 12 thin coats everywhere else. Between every 2 coats, I used the blue sanding pads to smooth everything down. I let the finish cure for about 2 weeks, then did the final sanding, 6 grades of wet sandpaper. A very rewarding step was polishing the instrument with 2 grades of polishing compound loaded onto a drill-mounted buffing wheel. It was great to see the final finish show up. On to the bridge. Here was another use for the flex shaft tool holder and another use for the UHMW poly material. The fence pivots on the bolt on the left, and the height of the cut can be adjusted from below. The bridge looks like this after the first few passes, and I added the angled saddle notch by placing a wedge between the fence and the piece. I tipped the bridge slightly to drill holes for the strings. I made saddles and nuts out of bone, and you should know bone is very stinky to work with. I rough cut the shapes with the bandsaw, then thinned them with the thickness sander by holding the small pieces secure in a thin chunk of wood with a notch cut in it. A jeweler's saw and files helped with the final shaping of the bone pieces. The bridge has been sanded and trim pieces are ready to be glued into place, then filed smooth. It will be finished with True Oil. Time to glue the bridge in place. I used Gorilla Glue for this job and clamped the bridge with these homemade cam clamps. Pins drilled through the saddle notch and soundboard kept the bridge from slipping. Bridge in place, string notches filed into the saddle, nut mounted and notched. The frets are flat filed, rounded and polished. Strings are attached, and here we are. The reward is playing that first chord. Having completed 12 flat-topped instruments with reasonable success for an amateur, I decided to try a carved-top mandolin and ended up making 3. Several of the steps are similar to those in the first part of this video, but there are significant differences, and I'll try to focus on those here. I was somewhat intimidated at the thought, but bought some more tight-grained Sitka and figured maple and forged ahead. The soundboard and the back start out as 3/4 inch thick book-matched pieces. After cutting out the slightly oversized shape on the bandsaw, I flattened the inside surfaces by sanding on the marble slab. I removed some of the waste material around the edges with a router, then laid out some contour lines by poking holes through the pattern with an awl and connected the dots with a pencil. The contour lines told me what thickness should remain under each one, so I set the drill press accordingly. On the soundboard, the thickest part in the center is 17 millimeters and it drops down to 2 millimeters before getting back up to 4 millimeters at the edge. I cut out a form from 3/4 inch plywood to hold the piece in place when I was working on it. So after drilling all those holes, I had to get rid of wood until the tip of the drill holes disappeared. I used planes, chisels, and the random orbital sander. Finally, the drill holes have disappeared and the surface is smooth. Now to carve the inside. The plan indicates how thick the top or bottom should be at various points from 2 to 4 millimeters, so more contour lines are drawn. I used this device to set the hole depth by measuring the gap between the drill tip and the rounded block. Again, chisels and the random orbital sander were used, and the cabinet scrapers did the final work. Once the top is carved, it's time to glue in the bracing. Note that the braces are asymmetrical. There is a base and a treble side. This picture also shows the holes drilled earlier to locate the center of the F-holes. Using the holes as a guide, I outlined the shape of the F-holes, then coated the area with epoxy to reduce the chance of splintering or tear out. I clamped the form and the soundboard so they stuck out from my workbench so I could work from underneath. A variety of bits and sanding drums helped me here, and then I finished the holes with files and eventually sandpaper. Time to bend the sides, glue in the head and tail blocks, and install the kerfed lining. The neck is figured maple, with the two halves separated by a laminated contrasting core. The truss rod curves down into the neck, then back up toward the fretboard. The sharp bend down anchors it in place. This is the underside of the headpiece trim, routed to accept the white plastic binding material used for accent. The binding material gets glued in place with acetone. Ready to be cleaned up. Time now for the final shaping of the neck. Now for a hard part, fitting the neck to the body. It took many small steps and a lot of patience to get this stage ready to glue up. I was never able to get the fit perfect, but glued it up with the neck and body aligned carefully. When the glue was set, dowels and thin wedges made a solid joint. Now I could glue the soundboard and back in place and route out the binding channels. I use a shouldered bit and a different fitting on the flex shaft setup for the mandolins. The little piece of binding on the neck took some care. It requires a sharp bend. The binding gets glued, then held in place with, wait for it, binding tape. The white plastic gets wrapped around the fretboard, again using acetone and some shaped clamping cauls to hold everything in place. These are bound frets, in that the end of the tang is hidden by the plastic. This means that an extra notch must be cut at the ends of each fret. The fretboard support piece has been roughly shaped, and here is sitting loosely in place. Before the fretboard is installed, this piece gets glue plus 2 countersunk screws screwed into the head block. Time for the same finishing steps that were used for the other instruments, with 6 coats of finish on the soundboard and 12 everywhere else. Then wet sand up to 2000 grit, let cure, and polish. I started making bridges out of this, but just didn't like the look of it, so I dug out a small piece of ebony that I had bought from Lee Valley Tools years ago. With careful planning, I was able to get 3 bridges made from it. The outer 2 or 3 centimeters of the bottom of the compensating bridge need to firmly contact the soundboard, so after shaping it roughly to size, sandpaper on the soundboard got it to the correct curve. The upper portion of the bridge was a little fussy to make, but after careful filing, it was done. The pick guard is made from a sheet of tortoiseshell acrylic, and this piece, laminated from the same material, is fixed to the underside of the guard to provide a means to attach the guard to the fretboard support piece. Acetone is used to glue it all together. The acrylic was easy to sand and polish, and I glued a pea-sized piece of neoprene to the outer edge of the guard to support it there. Almost there. Time to mount the tuners and string it up. So here's the back side, front side, and we're all done. I have really enjoyed building these instruments, and it makes me happy to think they just might bring pleasure to others for quite a long time.